So I'm going to be talking about, Microsoft and what we do in the retail space. So with legacy modernization, and very briefly, a lot of people don't necessarily think of Microsoft as maybe having anything to do with things of like moving applications off the mainframe, but there's a few of us at Microsoft, and there's more than a few, who've actually been around mainframes for a number of years prior to coming with Microsoft. So just very briefly, I've been with Microsoft over 25 years, but I spent almost 18 years prior to that working on IBM and Unisys mainframes, enterprise Unix systems too. So I've seen a lot of different systems over the years, and some of them have been with retail systems. And also some of the analytics systems that are running on the mainframe for collecting data, et cetera, that then in turn are used to do things like was mentioned in the last presentation with technologies like Synapse. So definitely one of the reasons to go is to get some of the capabilities of the that Azure is going to bring to the table, and getting the applications closer makes it easier to make that happen. So with that, I'm briefly going to talk about the platforms that we talk about when we mean a legacy transformation. I'm going to talk about some of the goals and options. Maybe take a look at a few details for doing an actual transformation. Then I got just a summary of sort of how you might going about this yourselves with your company too. So with that, I'll jump right in. And what do we mean by mainframe and mid-range platforms? Well, at least in Microsoft terminology, a mainframe is an IBM Z series system. That could be a number of different operating systems. ZOS is by far the most common, but you also have ZTPF, ZVM, virtual machine, ZVSE, it's kind of like a smaller mainframe. And there's Z Linux, that's where you can run Linux on mainframe platforms. So those are looking at the IBM Z series, but there's also Unisys. There's a fair amount of Unisys out there. We do run into that in retail customers, and Unisys comes in two flavors. It comes into the Sperry branch of Unisys, which is OS 2200, and it comes in the Burroughs branch, which is MCP or Master Control Program. So there's a couple of different options that we might see for mainframes, and they have paths into Azure. But there's also what some people refer to as mid-range, which is the IBM Power Systems. This is things like running OS 400. So you might actually have a Z series in the main office, but you might be running a power system, in AS 400, that's the hardware, OS 400 being the operating system. You might be running out in the stores. I do see that a fair amount with retailers, but there's also another type of system that can run, and that's the Power Platform, and on the Power, and that's the AIX or the Linux. So there's a fair amount of those out there, especially if we get into stores. But we also cover things like SunSpark and the new Fujitsu hardware for running SunSpark, and HPUX for things like the Superdome. So we do see all of these with customers who have legacy environments in retail. And the key thing here is all of these systems do have a path to Azure. That path might be what we call Rehost, which is essentially taking it as it is today and moving it into Azure and perhaps deploying it more in a containerized fashion, but it's still functioning pretty much the same as it did on the legacy platform. There's Refactor. That's where you can take the code that is written. It's predominantly probably in COBOL, especially in retail, but it might also be in something like PL1. And we also see people with assembler, and we do see other languages out there too. The refactor is where I keep more or less the same structure for the architecture, but I want to change the language. I want to bring it into something like Java, or I want to bring it into C#, or something like that, where I can find programmers who aren't as hard to find as the COBOL programmers. Then finally, there's re-architect. That's where the system probably is not doing what I want it to do, and I want to start off and get a new start as I bring it over into Azure. Now, I might need some of the capabilities, especially the non-functional capabilities that Mainframe provided me, but I don't want to have the same architecture. And the other thing that I would just add is we see all kinds of different sizes of systems that are being moved. Mainframes are sometimes measured in what's called MIPS, or millions of instructions per second. And the smaller ones would be something like 100 MIPS, but the large ones can be over 100,000 MIPS. So we actually have, seen all of those in what we have been moved from mainframes into Azure. And as I mentioned, Microsoft is really not new at doing this. We've been helping customers move off mainframes for about 12 years. Now, that didn't start with Azure. It started with moving to Windows, but within the past 3 years, definitely Azure has been the way that most customers are interested in moving their environments. So let's look at some of the transformation options and goals, what we're trying to accomplish by even going through this. Typically it's to give some flexibility and choice of what you're deploying. With retail customers, we see actually a fair amount of ISV applications that they have. A lot of other, types of customers, verticals, you see less of that. But in retail, definitely see ISV solutions. And quite often those ISV solutions have, a version that will run on non-mainframe platforms. We also have a sort of unique capability if it can't run on the platform, but you have IP rights for it to move it off the mainframe into that. And I'll talk briefly about that a little bit later. But agility is also a big driver, getting into a more agile environment where I can change things around more quickly to meet business needs. And then I can't forget TCO. That's probably one of the biggest things we see in retail. Definitely, we have the capability of significantly lowering the hardware cost for being able to run systems, your operating cost, and if you're moving, and some of these platforms perhaps are increasing the maintenance charges ISVs are doing because they have fewer customers, so therefore they're increasing the cost for the ones they still have. And so those are, one of the biggest reasons for getting off the platform, especially in retail. Then lastly, the skills. I already mentioned that, let's say I've got COBOL applications and I want to bring in people who are not part of, who don't know COBOL, or people who, because that's not a skill that's typically taught in universities these days. So if you're looking for getting developers and bringing them in, especially junior ones, you probably COBOL is not the language that you will find people with those capabilities. So let's talk briefly about the fact that we do have a transformation program, and how do we enable that? Well, we enable it by having an ecosystem of specialized partners. What do I mean by that? Well, remember we talked about having a rehost, a refactor, and re-architecture. Well, if I'm going to rehost, I have to have the capability of running those COBOL programs not on a mainframe, but in Azure. And to do that, I need to have something that will give the services those COBOLs need to run. And by that, I mean things like CICS or IMS. Those are what are called transaction monitors that run on the mainframe. Also, the DB2 is the mainframe database. But there's also a lot of more like flat files, like vSAM files, that's virtual sequential access method, that are on the mainframe, and those actually fit nicely into something like a NoSQL solution. So we do have partners that we work with who can provide some of those services, or Microsoft actually has those services ourselves that we can provide. We do have a heritage of doing these. As I mentioned, we've been doing it for a while. And so with those types of proven systems, we can reduce the risk, because risk is probably one of the things that keeps people on the mainframe the longest. They're afraid that to undertake the, well, what if it doesn't work correctly? So, having that type of experience will help you make and get to some of that savings that I talked about. So, one of the kinds of things that, we typically see in mainframe transformation scenarios in retail, we see a lot of data, DB2, a lot of data out there. And we see a lot of warehouse and logistics applications. Quite often, these are some of the ISV applications we see, and can work with folks for finding the appropriate, system to run over in the Azure platform. And perhaps it's moving off the system, or perhaps there's an Azure version that can run. We also do see point of sale integration and reconciliation, and actually getting the data from point of sale systems that you can then take and then move over into some of those analytics for, like sensing the, what's happening with demand reconciliation and things of that nature. So we see those. We see a retail reference data solutions that, where the, all the storing of all that data on a reference that we work with. And finally, we see a lot of store applications that require central processing. That would be things like maybe the pharmacy requires some central processing to do, or perhaps you've got applications that are doing, more of a time and attendance or vacation planning and scheduling and things like that. So we've seen a number of those scenarios where we've done migrations as we've been moving. And so all of those can basically go through one of those rehosting scenarios that I'm showing here. These are sort of the paths you can take, which is this is sort of our version of the Gartner 5 R's, but we added another one to make it 6, and that's called remote hosting. That's where we actually work with people who will host your Z-Series hardware. Microsoft does not host Z-Series hardware, but we do work closely with some who do. And the ones we work with usually have a what they call a flex type contract, where they will allow you to start moving to Azure once you move to their Z hosting platform, as long as you still use their services for doing the hosting. So why would you do that? Well, typically they can maybe reduce your costs a little bit, not as much as you would get by completely going to Azure, but let's say you needed to have costs reduced more quickly than it takes to actually do the migration to the different platform, then perhaps that might be interesting. Retiring applications, that's, it's discarding them. I'm not going to spend much time on that. Retaining, this is where we would be integrating in with other systems. Replacing, this is where you might have a different ISV application. But, the ones that we see the most are the replatform, the rehost, and refactor. So by replatform, I mean take the actual load modules that are on a mainframe and then move them over into Azure. There's actually a solution that's out there where you don't even have to recompile. You can take that load module across, and you can then use the partner software to convert that over into something that will run on x86. That type of system is where perhaps you don't own the or don't have the source for the application, and you don't want to go through getting that source, but you do have the ability to move it to another platform. That's a possible solution for you. The rehost, what we mean there is you are moving it to you know, a x86 system, but you're retaining the you know, the code, and then the refactor I already mentioned is moving to something like Java or C#. Then finally, we do have the re-envision. The re-envision's typically the one that takes the longest, but it might also provide the biggest value to you if your current applications perhaps aren't meeting the business challenges that you need. So the next thing I do want to talk a little bit about is we can map a lot of the capabilities that the mainframe has. Over the years, we've taken and moved those capabilities into both Windows and into Azure. You know, in the x86, we work closely with our hardware partners like Intel and AMD to do this. The first one I'll talk about is machine check architecture that was actually implemented, you know, back in the early 2000s, and that came through work that our team did to show that this is something the mainframe did. We need to do that too. Looking for things like a parallel sysplex, that's the capability of having sort of a tightly coupled systems that you could then share data and across. Well, you can get those kinds of capabilities in Azure with you know, our different Azure abilities to have regional available replication services, but we also can use caching services like Redis Cache in Azure to do that same type of memory and data sharing. You know, we also have things for the independent service processor with things like doing Azure Virtual Machine and Management Console. And it keeps going on. You know, the virtualization actually started on the mainframe, but certainly we have that in Azure. Certainly, we have to account for the different types of security that you have, and the mainframes sometimes call compute on and upgrade on demand. Well, we've got elastic computing that we have within Azure. And then if you go the next one, we definitely can, I think, have a lot of capabilities in the AI perspective. And then DevOps is an area that often is looked at why you want to move off the mainframe. And some customers will actually move off the development before they even move off the applications themselves. So there's a lot of different types of things you might want to do as you're moving through the you know, transformation process. So commonly addressed areas that we look at, we do take a look at all the compute capabilities that you have, which is the general purpose processors. Those are the GPs, IFLs. That's the integrated facility for Linux, ZIPS processors. Those are specialized data processors. So we look at all of those and how to best map those into Azure. We look at LPARs, the logical partitions that allow multiple versions of the operating system to run. Well, guess what? VMs in Azure will give you that capability, or even more modern. You might want to do that within containers running in Azure, deployment to something like Kubernetes with AKS. Again, there's different operating systems, so each one of them needs to have a correspondent. We need that kind of high performance storage. We need support for the languages you have on the mainframe. All the languages that I have listed there can be either supported or converted as moving into Azure. And one thing mainframes do really well is high performance, you know, backbone for low latency within their systems. We can also achieve something similar within Azure. So we've got a lot of different capabilities, and you know, we have worked with them over the years to make sure that those, you know, give you that kind of capability over into Azure also. So this just gives you some component comparisons that you have. If you look at a mainframe, the different things that you might have on it, and then how you might map those. Now, this is doing it from what I would call a rehost perspective, meaning you're trying to keep things more or less in the same, you structure as you had them on the mainframe, and you can even run them like you were running them on the mainframe. Let's say I've got green screens that are still out there, either in my corporate offices or they're being done in on my stores, that you could still keep those. You could also certainly move them into web environments, etc. So I also wanted to talk about the fact that you could take it and do something that's even, that's a little bit more of a transformation. This is where I could be taking, and I might take a mainframe application and I might put it through something like a load balancer to then run it into multiple Kubernetes nodes that are running in a cluster, and then take that and I might pair it up to things like Cosmos DB, which is our NoSQL solution, or different relational databases like SQL Azure or Postgres DB. And oh, by the way, since I do have that data running in Azure, I can then take that and be able to integrate that in with the analytics that was discussed in the prior, session. And with that, I could either do it through this style or I could do it in this style, which is more of a rehost, where I'm actually using a partner solution to give the capabilities in VMs or PaaS services to provide things like CICS or IMS transaction monitor emulation as they're running. Then all of this can run in an environment where the data is integrated back and forth with something like Azure Data Factory, and then the actual storage might even be geo-replicated across regions. So I guess the point of all this is you're given a very highly available environment which can then support the types of applications you would run with the rigor that you would have had on the mainframe. So a lot of people ask me, well then, okay, how do I do this? How do I map compute from what's on the mainframe to what I would do in Azure? And so Microsoft actually did a study where we took and we tried to, we ran a benchmark and compared running on a mainframe. It was an 8,000 MIPS mainframe running that with how it maps to cores running in a x86 platform. And what we found is that at least with this TPC-E style, system that we ran, we got about 170 MIPS per core for running it batch, and about 288 MIPS per core running in a online environment with CICS. And so this is an actual published study that was done by Gartner. This was done several years ago, but it basically still applies. And we've taken that benchmark and we have run that with several partners with their solutions in Azure. And we've run up to approximately 25,000 MIPS just for one set of VMs. That's why we can scale to up to hundreds of thousands of MIPS, because you typically don't have, even on the largest mainframes, a single application that's using all the MIPS. Typically they're run in there's multiple logical partitions. So this is giving you just an estimate of, like, if you were doing 8,000 MIPS like that prior your study was showing, what you actually might deploy that on. This is using VMs rather than PaaS services predominantly, but it's giving you some ideas in the cost differentials that you could potentially get. And as mentioned, it is quite a big difference here. It's like a 90% savings that you can get with when you compare the costs of the compute. Now, there are other costs involved, but this is one of the big ones that is taken out. So just to summarize here, we're looking at, we can actually go through, we consider it a journey that you go through to moving off a mainframe, especially if you've got, say several thousands or tens of thousands or MIPS. Typically, you don't just pull the plug on that over a weekend. You go through a process where you analyze your workloads, see what gets moved into more as rehost, what you're going to refactor, when you're going to re-architect. And it doesn't have to be just one, it could be a combination of those. And then we go through a process where you would then be able to do that in a secure and a predictable manner to make the risk such that you're not going to get interruptions to your business in the process. So with that, I'm at just about at time, and we do have some resources. We've got a lot of white papers that we have available. This is